We live in a time when everything is dictated by materialistic science, which says there is no great beyond. There are no intimate inner realms, subtle realms. So it's very difficult to try and explain to people that they have been here before and they will be here again. Whether they believe that or not is up to them. But if we do know that we are part of a long journey going in and out of different bodies in different eras and cultures and epochs in history, as men and women, as rich people, as poor people, as people of influence, as beggars in the gutter, if we go through all these different roles, then that's the purpose of human existence, to experience as many of these things as possible in order to promote soul growth and the evolution of that soul over many, many, many different lives.
Welcome, everyone, to the very first episode of That Death Show, where we want to help eliminate the fear of death. We want to explore consciousness and all that is, and the esoteric meaning of everything. The most important objective here for us is to offer comfort and insight, and we'll explain how and that consciousness survives the death of the physical body. And since we're right here in the thick of Halloween, we're going to do what other shows don't. They stop at the scare and telling the horror story. They stop there, but here we're going to be sharing esoteric science's explanations of the what and how and why, what ghosts are, ghouls, apparitions, poltergeists, hauntings, all of it. I don't know of any other show that does that. So that's why we're doing it here on That Death Show. And speaking of, and since this is our maiden voyage, our very first time together, I am very excited to introduce my co-host and my very dear friend. He's a fellow old school radio and television broadcaster. You'll be able to tell that when he cracks his mic. He is also a selfless and dedicated student of the esoteric teachings. He's an award-winning filmmaker, and his latest project is called The Myth of Death, which is one of the reasons why we're here. You can watch it for free on That Death Show YouTube channel. He's an author, an international speaker from Yorkshire, England. He's been a reporter for the BBC, for ITV, and for Sky News. He's written many books. He's a hell of a writer, and I've got one right here. We're going to be giving some of these away. This is Everyone's Book of the Dead. He's also written Cycles of Eternity. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, please welcome my co-host, the one and only Tim Wyatt. Welcome, Tim.
Thank you very much indeed, Anne, and it's very good to be here for this first death podcast. And when I've told people about this, they've accused me, as always, of being very morbid. But we're going to show in these podcasts how there's no reason to look on death as a morbid topic. Death is intimately entwined in life, and the sooner we understand that, the better it will be for everyone.
That's true, and that's why we're doing this. So instead of just talking about hauntings and individual near-death experiences, we're going to go beyond. We're going to go way beyond where most people ever dare. Today's episode is titled Dying and Attitudes to Death. Now, Tim, one of my very favorite things that you say in many of your talks is reincarnation is making a comeback. Now, I know that in the Eastern world, it's different than the Western world. Can you expand a little bit on that, please?
Absolutely. When I was born as part of the baby boom in the early 1950s, reincarnation was a word that just existed probably in a few academic books. It hadn't seeped at all into popular consciousness. During the 1960s and the times of the counterculture, and perhaps a little bit before that, notions largely drawn from Eastern religions like Buddhism and Hinduism had persuaded people that there was perhaps such a thing as rebirth. Despite what the prevailing religion of Christianity taught them, people began to feel otherwise. And this has increased and increased and increased over the decades, so that now reincarnation is still a minority belief in the West, but only just. A recent survey by the Pew Research Company, they're a highly respected research company who operate in the United States and also in Europe, and they do attitude surveys to all kinds of different things. And a recent one from them found that around a third of all Americans believe in reincarnation in some form or another. And amongst younger people, the figure rises to 40% amongst those aged around 18 to 29. And interestingly, far more women believe in reincarnation than men, 38% of women compared to only 27%. But what's really interesting about this research is that America is a much more religious country than the UK, arguably. And despite the fact that Christianity outlawed notions of reincarnation 15 centuries ago, around 30% of all American Christians believe in reincarnation. But there are huge variations depending on which branch of Christianity you belong to. So 47% of Hispanic Catholics believe in it, but only 60% of evangelicals believe in it. However, religion doesn't seem to be necessarily the only deciding factor here, because 44% of those who, quote, believe in nothing in particular, they embrace reincarnation, as do 32% of agnostics, and unbelievably, 12% of self-confessed atheists also believe in reincarnation. So there's been a huge shift, and I think it's moving very much in that direction, despite what Christianity has to say on the subject.
I find that very, very comforting, actually, because in looking at nature, right? Nature, the leaves, they fall, they go back into the earth to nurture for the next year, the next cycle of life. So this ever-evolving cycle, this eternal circle, to me, that's very comforting. I find a lot of solace in that. And more people are beginning to embrace this cycle of life and death. And as you mentioned, atheist, you don't have, it's not religion. You can believe in death and an afterlife without being religious, and it's not morbid. Talking about death is not morbid. It's not dark. I love to talk about it. I find it comforting, calming, and reassuring, and I think that's why some of us like ghost stories. But it's not taboo. It's not morbid, really, to talk about. The one thing that's guaranteed, all right, when you are born, is that there will be change, and then you die. That's two things. You know what I mean. There's change, and then death. Why, Tim, when it is such a natural thing, why do people find it so difficult to talk about death?
Well, I think over the last 2.5 centuries, since the Industrial Revolution, since people have moved from the countryside to towns and cities, they've become much more divorced from the natural world, and therefore the natural rhythms of life. And they fail to see death in the context in which it exists. It's an intimate part of life, and it's just part of a greater cycle. And when we talk about life and death, we're only talking about the death of the physical body. We have within us principles, aspects, which survive the death of the physical body. And we'll be talking about these in some detail in the coming weeks and everything. So I think this is very important to understand what death actually is. It's just, as you say, like a leaf falling off a tree, a seed planting in the ground, and this process of constant renewal. That's what it's all about.
I find that very comforting. I really do. I love that death show. And I think possibly the fear comes from the unknown, that the transition from the physical, because we're here in the physical world and all we can see, taste, touch, hear, and smell, that's all there is. And I think that's probably why people are frightened, because we see it as an absolute ending. Because for those of us who are still here in our earthly bodies, that life has ended in our temporary forever here on the planet. For that's all our physical bodies can see and understand.
And one of the problems that face people on any kind of spiritual journey, any people who aspire to any kind of spiritual ascent in their life, is the fact that the world is dominated by science, which is largely materially based, and it doesn't see any reality or any dimensions beyond the physical. And this is a huge problem. So it is actually quite surprising that so many people do believe in rebirth, when science, which shapes popular consciousness to a greater degree, arguably, than anything else, certainly religion in the West, says otherwise. There's no such thing as soul or spirit or anything like that. What you see, what you perceive with your 5 physical senses is all there is, end story. And this is a problem, because this limits people. And this is what ultimately causes the fear, because they think, oh, I can only be in a physical body. Once the physical body is gone, it's death, annihilation, good night, Vienna.
That is true. And all of these ageless teachings, we've called it theosophy, we've called it esoteric science and occult knowledge, all of them talk about and teach this understanding that this is not something new, not just from the New Age movement or a newfangled way of thinking. These teachings are ageless and eternal, and that's what we're getting into in this podcast, That Death Show, to help understand that there is far more than just the physical. And when we do get into that, we're going to be touching on karma and reincarnation, the balance that no one gets away with anything, and that death is simply a new beginning. We often say that you can learn the meaning of life by understanding death. Now, people look at me like I'm insane when I say that, and I can only say as much as I currently understand to this day, because I'm still learning, and every day, I have more questions than answers. That's why I'm glad that you're here. So would you please explain to those who are listening and viewing that we can learn by understanding death, we can learn the meaning of life?
Now available on Kindle, the greatest collection of the ancient wisdom in our modern era. Over 1,000 pages in 4 volumes. Unfolding Consciousness, now online all over the world for only $24.99. Karma, reincarnation, what happens after death, all with references and links to the original teachings going back thousands of years. The truth behind all philosophy, science, and religion. Unfolding Consciousness, exploring the living universe and the intelligent powers in nature and humans. Now available in ebook on Amazon.
Well, it's simply understanding that we as human beings, we're born as helpless babies. We go through various stages of maturity. We reach adulthood, and then we go into a period of decline and the physical body dies. And that's true for everything in the universe, from a tiny atom to a galaxy. They all have a particular life cycle. We live in one of the few times in history where people don't believe in reincarnation. Okay, the ancient Egyptians didn't really believe in reincarnation, but they did believe in the survival of some aspect of that person, call it the soul. So we live in a time when everything is dictated by materialistic science, which says there is no great beyond. There are no intimate inner realms, subtle realms. And so it's very difficult to try and explain to people that they have been here before and they will be here again. Whether they believe that or not is up to them. But if we do know that we are part of a long journey going in and out of different bodies in different eras and cultures and epochs in history, as men and women, as rich people, as poor people, as people of influence, as beggars in the gutter, if we go through all these different roles, then that's the purpose of human existence, to experience as many of these things as possible in order to promote soul growth and the evolution of that soul over many, many, many different lives.
Yes, it is eternal. And when we say eternal, that's kind of hard for us to get our heads around that. That's a long, long time. Also, from the universal perspective, from this tiny little blue dot that we live on in this one little solar system, that we are a part of a much bigger, ever-expanding expansion of consciousness. So, in some of our previous conversations, Tim, we've touched on the fact that we don't just incarnate here on Earth either, do we?
Well, there are many different schools of thought on this. There are people who propose that we do reincarnate elsewhere in other systems. And throughout history, there has been a very intimate connection between different groups of people on Earth and certain star systems, which seem to crop up again and again and again. The Pleiades, Sirius, and one or two others. These particular places seem to have some sort of connection with the Earth. There are people who go as far as to say that the Earth or human beings were seeded or created or genetically modified, or somehow they are the product of these off-worldly beings. So I think it's quite possible that we incarnate in other worlds, in other places. But what I am convinced of, and certainly some Hindu people believe, that you can be reincarnated as, we might call it, lower kingdoms of nature. But certainly in the traditions that I understand, once you have become human, That's it. There's no going back as a tree or a dog. As nice as that might sound, it's not a possibility.
Yes, in our teachings, it is taught that we go from mineral to vegetable to animal to human, and then all of the hierarchies beyond that. So we humans, though, I must say, are far more beast-like than many animals on our planet. We are quite cruel, and we're the beasts. That's my opinion. And I think that perhaps we just still have a very, very long way to go.
Well, to put it mildly, we're still very much a work in progress. And when you look at people across this earth, there is a huge, huge spectrum of people who are developed physically, mentally, spiritually, and in other ways. I mean, there is a vast spectrum of people, and how they display that. There is a vast difference in the way people are obtaining a sense of morality and practicing a sense of morality. You know, that varies hugely amongst people. So you might get intellectual people who are still ruled by very raw emotions, and therefore that clouds their judgment. So because of this wide spectrum of different people, I mean, it's very difficult to look at where human beings are, but certainly some human beings still display largely animal characteristics. And this comes out particularly in times of war, when civilized people can do unspeakably brutal things to each other.
It is heartbreaking. It is overwhelming. But I do have much hope for humanity. That's one of the reasons I'm so attracted to the perennial philosophy, the ageless wisdom. We put them into practice and we become them. And they are compassion. They are empathy. They are understanding. They're unity. Death is as night to day. There is nothing to fear. And a little segue here as we approach Halloween. What are your thoughts, Tim, on the media and fear and how they may spin and conceptualize death like in movies or the news?
Well, I mean, having worked certainly in the news media for most of my life in one form or another, it's one of the top currencies of journalism, death. I mean, death sells, you know, in one form or another. There's nothing more that a reporter likes than what we used to call a nice, juicy murder. You know, British people are obsessed with murder and have been for decades, with Agatha Christie, all the crime novels. Every series on the TV seems to be a police drama with bodies everywhere, you know, even in places where people are most unlikely to kill each other, but they still manage to do this. So death is part of the whole superstructure of both the entertainment media and the news media, particularly at the moment with conflict in Ukraine, in the Middle East. And in fact, I was checking this the other day. There are 110 separate wars going on in the world at the moment. There are only 180 countries and 110 wars.
Oh, God, we have been doing that forever since we got here. When are we going to learn? We have a very long way to go. And it's true that news segments, when they open, they lead with a death, a murder, it's a war, it's a shooting, it's some horrible crime, and that is massive. Stories of death, crime, and sex sell. And as you say at the beginning of the documentary, The Myth of Death, you say death is everywhere, and it is. It's all around us. And one of our favorite chapters here from Dr. Eddie Villamoria's Unfolding Consciousness, Exploring the Living Universe and the Intelligent Powers in Nature and Humans is from Volume 2. It is Chapter 5, Death is Transition, Time at the Door of Eternity, as well as your own Everyone's Book of the Dead. Death is a transition, like a phase transition. It's only a doorway to a new beginning. Can you explain a little bit to our viewers how death is a doorway, not an ending, but a brand new chapter? You go on.
Well, what we have to understand before we can really answer that is that human beings are more than just their physical bodies. These are the parts of ourselves that we occupy for the whole of our physical lives and are most aware of. What we have to understand is that we have a number of subtle bodies, and I won't go into great detail about these now. Some of these subtle bodies die shortly after the physical body, but some of them, the higher aspects of ourselves, spend time on the inner planes and produce a seed, and that seed is reactivated in a new life. That's the simplest way I can describe this. There is a period in between lives, sometimes a long period, sometimes a much shorter period, depending upon individual circumstances. So once we die, certain aspects of ourselves go onto subtle planes, the first of which we normally call the astral plane. The astral plane is a mirror, a non-physical mirror image of the physical plane. So everything in the physical world has its astral counterpart. And this astral realm is also home to dead animals. It's also, its main occupants are thought forms produced by human beings. Now, these things might be very transitory, or they might be very, very long-lasting. So the astral plane is where we initially go once we die. And essentially, it's a place like an assessment center or a refinery or a purification center, where the more unpleasant aspects of ourselves are filtered out and distilled down into the best aspects of ourselves. Again, this is stating it very simply. So it's like taking a load of wine and distilling it down into the finest brandy. That's what it does. And this refined part of ourself is then reactivated when we're born again.
There is so much there. Now listen, if you're watching and viewing and you have questions, don't worry, so do I. I have more questions when we do these than ever before. All right, there's a whole bunch of subjects we can do whole series on and individual episodes like the astral plane, that thoughts are living forces. We need to choose them wisely. They're not just little blips that pass by and are private. There's much more to that. They actually have a life force and they grow. All right, so we're just literally skimming the surface here today. We welcome your participation and we want to know what you think and what you want to know more of. We are just beginning this journey together. We're both very, very passionate and we'd love to get these out there so more people can have access to these ageless teachings. It is said that the astral world that we're talking about is very close physically to the material world. It's right next to us. What are your thoughts on that, Tim?
Yes, some parts of the astral world are very closely connected to the physical world and almost bleed over into each other. The astral world is not kind of a separate world. It interpenetrates, as do all these other subtle realms. So it's not like layers in a cake as such. But the astral world is divided into a number of regions or locations or levels, if you like. And so you will go to a place where the conditions are most suitable for your personality, for your astral body to be. So, there are places where the less developed people will go, where average people will go, and where more exceptionally developed people will go. So it's very much like a kind of an education system where there are all sorts of different levels from kindergarten right up to PhD.
Yeah, and some people that have ventured out using astral projection or meditation, they come back with a warning and they say, be careful if you do this, because if you leave your body and sleep or venture out into the astral world, there are entities and energies that do not have your best interest at heart. And some describe it as a heavy, a dense, a dark world, and there's also light there as well. Can you explain a little bit about that, Tim, please?
Well, what we have to remember is that although the astral world has its counterparts for the physical world, it's also what they call the subjective realm. The physical world, we can see all the objects around us in a particular room or environment. But in the astral world, it's very much it's an emotional world. It's based upon desire and emotion. So to some extent, what you expect is what you see. And if you die believing that you are a wicked sinner and that a devil with a trident is going to prod you into some flames for eternity, give you a real bad time, you may get that. If you believe that nothing at all happens after you die and that's it, that may also be what you get. If you believe that you've been a good person and you're destined to be reunited with Jesus or some other figure, then this may happen to you. So what you expect is probably what you'll get.
I understand. And that would also explain how some of us coming back from the near-death experiences see a religious being, and that is actually what we expected to see from our last incarnation. And some of those people come back and they say, see, I told you my religion was right. But I suppose they're going to see what they believe they're going to see, as you have explained. It's all the same source. It's all the same source, just in different appearances. So, by the way, these near-death channels are blowing up. They are so popular. Let's look at the commonalities of these near-death experiences, just as we would science, religion, and philosophy. And you can see these ancient teachings shining through. And that's what That Death Show is all about. So we talk about near-death experiences and past life reviews really quick. Tim, in these past life reviews, they say it's a 360 review of their life, and every action, every thought, every deed is experienced by them from the one that they affected, from the other's perspective. Now, some naysayers in the scientific and medical world, they say this is just a hallucination. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the ageless wisdom teachings, the perennial philosophy, almost without exception teaches that when we die, the first thing that happens is that we do undergo a life review of some kind. And there are different variants of how this might happen and unfold over a number of hours. Some people say it starts with the most recent memories and goes back to birth. Other people put it the other way around. The purpose of this, and indeed what occurs in near-death experiences, is not just the life review, but the effect that you have had on other people by your actions, or sometimes your inaction. So that's what the life review is all about. But the near-death experiences, you hit the nail on the head when you said there are so many different commonalities. And these near-death experiences are much more common today because of medical technology, and people can be kept alive who would have died previously. People describe going down a tube or a tunnel or something of that nature and emerging into the light, meeting Jesus or wise people or members of the family, being taken through a beautiful landscape, often with music and everything. Sometimes they're given particular knowledge, but always in these experiences, they reach a border of some kind, a stream or a wall or something, and they're told, this is as far as you can go. And they say, like it here, I don't want to go back to that horrible earth. I want to stay here. And they say, no, it's not your time yet. You have to go back. And many people then do return to their bodies, but very reluctantly. But everybody, virtually everybody, comes back from this there are some negative experiences. Yes, they do happen. But overall, people seem to come back with completely different attitude to life. People who've been selfish and greedy become altruistic. People don't have a fear of death anymore. So they can be very, very transformative experiences. And there are a number of very celebrated ones, like Dr. Aben Alexander, the neurosurgeon whose brain completely shut down, went on a week-long trip on the astral plane, came back and wrote about it, and knew that it couldn't have been a hallucination because his brain was completely non-functional. So he was operating in a different realm. It transformed him, and it transformed many other people.
Yes, it has. It's changed the whole landscape. Raymond Moody's Life After Life. There's been growth over the last 50 years, a lot more brave souls coming through over the last 20 years. It has gotten huge, especially with Anita Morjani and Wayne Dyer behind her and all that. It's massive right now. There's lots of NDE channels out there. As a matter of fact, you've been on a few, like Tia Renee. I love her show. It's growing exponentially. There's many more out there. So with so many people sharing their stories and their experiences of after death, near-death experiences, and these viewers taking away inspiration, hope, and comfort, these channels are growing. I love that. People are hungry for this information, but I do want to reiterate right here, this is so important. You don't have to have a near-death experience to have the wisdom that is gained there by those who have crossed over. And we tell you that right here on That Death Show. There are books and there are texts. There are many of them. You can study the esoteric wisdom. It's not a religion. You don't have to sign anything. You don't have to follow anybody. You don't have to pay any money. You don't have to have a near-death experience to gain the wisdom that the NDEers bring back with them. Now, in their life reviews, a majority of them explain so beautifully and even painfully that they watched and felt from the other's point of view, like a fight on a playground. They felt the punches. They felt the punches that they threw, the words that hurt so bad. They felt what that felt like. So this is balance and karma. As you do, so shall you reap. And as I understand it, you will experience it not only in a past life review, but in a physical body, in real life. You will live it as you have caused it. So in another physical incarnation, no one gets away with murder. All right? You will reap what you sow.
Truth is, no one ever gets away with anything. And it's not God or evil spirits who punish you. It's part of an immutable law, a universal cosmic law called the law of cause and effect, otherwise known as the law of karma. And reincarnation without some balancing, mediating, controlling principle like the law of cause and effect would be meaningless. So this states that every effect has a cause and every cause has an effect. There is nothing ever in the universe which happens without a cause. So if people come into a particular life with unfortunate circumstances, it's almost certainly down to the fact that they have done things in a previous life which one way or another need to be corrected in this life. The law of karma is not there per se to persecute and punish or reward, although that's how it may appear to some people. It's there, as you say, to preserve an equilibrium and a harmony and to help people to grow. I think as Eckhart Tolle, the mystical writer, wrote, suffering is some people's only spiritual teacher. Because without suffering, we don't understand, the context in which this all happens. The difficulty, Anne, that we face here, of course, is that most people don't remember their past lives. So if we come into this life with awful circumstances and can never get anything right, we might not know what the reasons specifically are for that. It might be something in our last life, might even be something in the life before that, as a 7th century Saxon peasant or something like that. So we just don't know this at this stage of our evolution. And people say, well, if reincarnation exists, why don't we remember these past lives? And there are very good reasons for that, which I think at some point we'll go into. There are very, very good reasons why, if we remembered all our past lives at our present stage of development, it would just overwhelm us and we'd be so assaulted by a sense of guilt and shame that we probably wouldn't be able to operate. So it's only as we go down that spiritual road and evolve into higher realms that we will have the ability to understand these things. But what I'll say now is that karma is responsible for most of people's circumstances. That doesn't mean to say that we don't have free will, because we do. But that free will has to be modified by a balance sheet. And this is what karma essentially is. And the Hindus talk a lot of this, and the Buddhists, about building up merit and doing good things just because they're good things to do, not necessarily by building up good karma for the future, but if that's a byproduct, then okay. So what it means is that we have to be very careful, not only about what we do and about what we say and feel and think even, because all these things send vibrations out into the universe. And ultimately, these things are going to come back and reshape our future lives. We live very much in a victim culture where victimhood is almost promoted in the world. And I don't like this at all, because victims may well now be suffering the consequences of things that they did to other people in other lives. Obviously, we don't know. But for people to indulge in a sense of victimhood takes away any sense of self-responsibility. And I don't want to sound too preachy, but if we're not responsible for our own lives, how can we be responsible for other people's lives as well? It's very much a question on any spiritual path, taking absolute responsibility as much as you can for what you do.
So well said. And as we even look at these difficulties in today's world, whether they be big, small, or huge and cataclysmic, from studying the ageless wisdom, from trying to put them into practice, I realize I am responsible somewhere. Nothing is happening to me that isn't supposed to be. All right. If I wasn't a part of its cause somewhere, somehow, it is difficult for me to look back when I was younger and even think about this. I couldn't get my head around it. But now I understand that this is meant to be. The good and the bad. I'm going to pave this karmic road the best I can. And how can I react to things differently? How can I overcome my lower self? How can I change my reaction? So when things are difficult, we're learning. And when things are good, we get to rest. That cycle never stops. This is the cycle of karma and reincarnation. There are no victims. There are no victims, but I will get people screaming at me sometimes that say, well, this little child was murdered, and validate that. Tell me, what kind of karma is that? I wish I could explain it, but if we could look at life as just a page in a book, in a chapter in a library of libraries that goes on forever, that there is so much more to our story, but I don't get a lot of warm response to that. I really don't. I get a lot of frustration. And hey, have you ever seen the movie Cloud Atlas? There's a book and a movie called Cloud Atlas.
No.
Well, it's a pretty interesting premise, really, where the past lives and the current lives and the future lives all change based on the behavior within whichever life you're in. So what you do in this life can affect not only your future lives, but also past lives, because time is not linear. There's lots more to it. It's the ultimate equilibrium. It's simply balance. Karma is not punishment. It's not being petty. It's not retribution. I grew up Catholic and I remember well, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. So it's not for you to seek revenge, because allow it to balance out for itself, because no one gets away with anything.
No, they don't. And we've been too heavily influenced by a religion that talks a lot about vengeance, and that is a problem. How can the religion of love also be so vengeful against those people that doesn't like, or it believes don't toe the line in a way?
Yes. Hashtag freedom from religion. It's so wonderful to hear these days that people are looking beyond the religion that they were raised in. They're not just taking somebody else's word for it. They're finding their way themselves. The internet allows you to have access to all these teachings absolutely free, and you can find out for yourself. There are lots of brilliant YouTube channels out there, new phenomenal paranormal content. You can see some hoaxes and people trying for views, but you can also see extraordinary footage of shadow people, of misted apparitions and ghostly figures. I believe you have a ghost story you'd like to share with us, Tim?
Well, I've had a couple, actually, because since we had this conversation, I remembered something else that had happened. But I run Leeds Theosophical Society, which is based in a very old 230-year-old building in the center of the city. And for a long time, we used to store various things down in these really aged, damp basements and everything. And I was down there 3 or 4 years ago, just painting and just reorganizing things. And whenever I went into a corner of one of the rooms, it felt intensely cold, like walking into a fridge or something like that. And eventually we had someone over to give a talk at the lodge. And this woman said that she had an intimate understanding of these things. She could sense these presences. And more than that, she could basically exercise them and get them to go off. So she did, came down, she did various things, and we've never experienced any other problems since then. Basically, that type of phenomenon, the haunted house mystery, the knight with the head under his arm, stalking through the medieval castle in the middle of the night in clanking armor. These are the archetypal type ghost stories. But many sensitive people will go into perhaps a church or a graveyard, and they will sense other things there. Now, what you have to understand about these ghosts, and what you have to understand is that they do have a reality. And as far as I understand it, one of the possibilities, and I'm not saying it's the only one, is that unbelievably, when some people die, they don't know that they've died initially. This is very hard to believe, but it is a fact. And they go on day after day, and they only realize that they're dead when people don't communicate with them anymore, when, they can't connect with physical objects anymore. But the point I'm trying to make is that some people, for a variety of reasons, might be anchored to the physical plane, either because through a sense of vengeance and they want to get back at someone, or something that they've undone, or some people that they need to look after. There could be a variety of reasons. And this is why you get cases of entities being attached particularly to buildings, sometimes for decades and sometimes for hundreds of years. But I think also because of the astral world and the other subtle realms, people during their lives leave imprints. I used to live in a house, my first house, about 45 years ago. It was an old Victorian house. And one day I was sitting at the top of the stairs just doing some work on one of the banisters, and I heard the front door go. And I knew that my wife was downstairs in the kitchen. And I saw a man and a woman in like Edwardian evening dress float on through. And one of them said to the other, "Marvelous evening, darling." And then they just disappeared, and that was it. And I hadn't been, doing anything to promote hallucinations. It was the middle of the day. I didn't particularly have any knowledge of it at the time. And I didn't mention it to anybody for a while, because obviously people start to think that you can be a little bit crazy. But it was very, very vivid. And these people looked to be quite solid. They didn't look ethereal in any way. And I have no way of explaining that.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that with us. And since the beginning of time, we humans have talked about ghosts, apparitions, and shadows, and things like that. We can't all just be making it up for countless thousands of years just to have a good scare once a year. Now, Christopher and I have one. I think I can share it with you here. I think so. My stepmother, who I really didn't have no one really had a good relationship with her. After she passed, my husband and I flew out there to look after my father. And the night after she died, we were staying in her room, in her bedroom. They had separate rooms, which was not a very wise idea because Dad was on the other side of the house. And as we were laying there that night, I could hear and feel scratching at the foot of the bed. And I thought, "Dad, it's not funny." I said to Christopher, "Do not do that." I thought that was his toenails. It was not him. He says, "I'm not doing that." But I could feel it. I could feel the pressure on the bed. I could hear the scratching just like that. And it was unbelievable. It was terrifying. And we got out of the room. We slept in the den across the house. And the next morning, books were moved that we had placed in certain areas. So lights would come on and off. And at the very end, as we were moving Dad out of that house, we had the smoke alarms were going off when things were said. It was a lot of interesting energy. She returned back to the house. I did not see her, but I definitely heard her and I felt her. So obviously there is lots to cover here. And I wanted to ask you, Tim, recently in the news, because we talk about when people exit, if it's sudden, if it's the right time. Did you read about the suicide pod and the people that got in trouble for, it was a woman from the States over in Switzerland, I think. Did you hear about that?
Well, I'm absolutely against that sort of thing. I mean, I'm very, very, very ambiguous about assisted dying. I mean, I can see it from certain points of view, but it is not to be recommended because, as we'll be dealing with in the weeks to come, suicide is very, very bad option for the ongoing journey of the soul. It comes with penalties. Obviously, suicides come into different categories. If you kill yourself trying to evade responsibility for something or other, or for your own life, for other people's lives or whatever, that's one thing. If you deliberately allow yourself to be killed in order to protect other people, if you're a teacher and someone throws a hand grenade through the school window and you jump onto it to protect the children, you are effectively committing suicide, but you're doing it for altruistic reasons. So the motivation as to why one would want to end one's own life depends very much on, the consequences of that, and the consequences will vary very much. But it is not a course of action to be recommended. Some people describe it as the greatest act of spiritual ineptitude. I'm perhaps overstating it, but I think should caution against it. And I'm very worried about this cult of suicide, which seems to exist amongst certainly certain young people these days. I think this is very, very worrying indeed. And I think it's testimony to the kind of world that we live in. If people feel that their future is so bleak, that that is the only option, this is a terrible state of affairs.
Whew, the physical world is a very difficult place to be. Earth is one of the most painful schools, the most toughest places to incarnate ever in the universe, is what they say. And it is difficult here. There's a lot of suffering here, but we cannot escape the lessons. You cannot leave early. If you're having a difficult time and you just want to put an end to it and say, I can't take it anymore, death is a transition. It's going through a doorway to a new beginning. Your physical body ends, but your earthly energy continues. You take off your earthly clothes and the clothes stay behind, but the you that wore those clothes goes right through the door. And the lessons, as painful as they can be, they cannot be escaped. We must evolve and continue to do the very best that we can here on planet Earth, because you don't just learn by inspiration, you learn through suffering. There is so much more for us to talk about. But really quick, Tim, do you have any final thoughts, any takeaways, anything we might have missed for our very first episode today?
I think one thing that we haven't touched on, and I think it's quite important, well, it's very important actually, our attitude and how we are when we die. And let's not forget that most people these days die in some sort of medical or quasi-medical setting, certainly older people anyway. And our attitude when we die very much shapes what's going to happen to us immediately afterwards. So if we're consumed by fear, then this is not a good thing, because it impedes us on our onward journey. One of the reasons I got into this years ago was that my father, when he died, was absolutely petrified. And, this disturbed me a great deal, because I thought, why do people only start to think about death when it becomes imminent to them? We should be considering this throughout our lives. It's not morbid to do that.
Death is imminent from the moment we are born. It is the one guarantee. And again, Tim's latest film can be found on That Death Show's YouTube channel. It's called The Myth of Death. It is hands down the most comforting film I have ever seen about death. It is free to watch on YouTube and also on Facebook at esoteric author Tim Wyatt. I'm going to try to get those links up for you here. Actually, The Myth of Death is why we are both sitting here today, because it is so important to talk about more than just the funeral, the arrangements, the end of life care. There's so much more to our incarnations, and both of us really wanted to be able to go deep into these questions and talk about all of this and get it out there, because in understanding what you will see when you watch The Myth of Death, which is only 45 minutes long, we wish to take away the fear, the horror, the discomfort, the mystery of death. Death is natural. It's normal as birth. Death comes to each and every one of us. And as Tim says, it's his quote here, death is not a tragedy. It's not fatal, it's not final, and it's not permanent. So what we're going to be doing is suiting up and showing up every single week, every single Wednesday. We're going to go deep into these topics. We're going to have guests, and we'd love to have your questions. This has been our very first go, and I think we did okay for our very first That Death Show, I think. It's really to ease and eliminate the fear of death. It's the esoteric meaning of everything. What do you think, Tim? How do you think we did?
Well, I think so, because what we're talking about are not just modern ideas. The ideas that we talk about are as old as time itself. They go back hundreds of thousands of years and possibly longer. We tend to think that everything from the past, if it's not modern, it must be somehow, defective and based on superstition and ignorance and everything. And that is not the case. There is a certain set of ideas, perennial philosophy, whatever you call it. And these ideas are timeless, because they're not human ideas, they're cosmic ideas. And human beings might think that they know best, but I think the cosmos knows best.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much. And thank you for listening and watching. And remember, you and your questions and your comments are so very welcome. Please, please, please remember, you can find That Death Show everywhere you get your podcasts, not just on YouTube. So if you could rate, review, subscribe, share, so we can get this out there so more people can have access to these teachings. Big shout out to the old Living Theosophy crowd. I love you. It's an honor to have you with us. And next week, I think we're definitely going to cover more of the astral world, more of the paranormal, more of the ghosts, and even some of the weird haunting things where they associate it with it's automatically a demon. It's not always a demon. It's not hardly ever a demon. But what is darkness? What is real evil? What happens after we die? And where do we go after we die? That's our subject for next week. Thank you, Tim Wyatt. I love you. I appreciate you. And I look forward to next week with you. So, see you then.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you. Now, people ask me why they should read my book, Everyone's Book of the Dead. Well, the Tibetans have one, the Egyptians have one, so why shouldn't everybody else? And this is panoramic compendium of death and dying, as well as the after-death states, karma and reincarnation throughout world history. So this book tells you everything you need to know about death, not just what happens when you die, but what happens on the inner planes afterwards. How long do we stay there? What does it look like? What might we be doing there? And how long is it before we eventually reincarnate in new bodies? Well, the answers are all here. Everyone's Book of the Dead, available from Firewheel Books.